Before sunrise, an English bomber base is almost invisible. Wind moves through rows of Nissan huts. A truck passes with its headlights hooded. Somewhere beyond the mist, 4 propellers catch the first weak light and turn a parked B-17 into a dark, hulking outline. On one of those hard stands Technical Sergeant Joseph Giambrone, hands already blackened, studying the Memphis Belle before the day has properly begun. He is close enough to see fresh streaks of oil around a cowling seam, close enough to run a hand along patched metal and feel where yesterday's damage ended and his crew's repair began. The men who will fly this bomber over Europe are still at briefing or breakfast. Joe is already at work. He knows the aircraft the way another man knows a machine shop or a family car, not in broad categories, but in tiny, recurring flaws. Which engine tends to run hot? Which fitting vibrates loose? Which gauge is accurate, and which one has to be treated with suspicion? By the time the crew climbs aboard, the airplane will either look ordinary or it will not fly. That decision will have been made here, in the cold, by men who will never appear in the victory photographs. And that is the first hidden truth of the story. The American air war over Europe did not begin in the air. It began on wet concrete and churned mud, in darkness, with mechanics reading aluminum like evidence. But if keeping one famous bomber alive was exhausting, the scale of what came next was far larger than one airplane. By late afternoon, the same base becomes a place of waiting. Ground crews drift toward the runway without being told. They look upward long before they can read serial numbers. At first, the returning bombers are only sound, engines rolling in from beyond the coast. Then shapes emerge out of haze, and every man on the line starts searching for his own aircraft. The relief can vanish instantly. A fortress appears with holes torn through the tail. Another limps in with an engine feathered. Sometimes a red flare signals wounded on board, and ambulances lurch forward before the aircraft has even stopped rolling. Once the wheels touch down, the pause between survival and labor is almost non-existent. Mechanics run beneath wings still ticking with heat. Armorers look into empty bomb bays. Crew chiefs climb ladders to inspect control surfaces, hydraulic lines, wiring, and shrapnel scars, while the smell of burned oil still hangs around the engines. This was the emotional weather of the 8th Air Force from the ground. Hope, recognition, dread, then immediate work. Joe Giambrone and his 10-man crew learned that a mission did not end when a bomber returned. Often that was when the harder part began. If another operation was scheduled for the next morning, the aircraft had to be turned around at once. A famous bomber was not made famous by one dramatic flight. It became famous because men on the ground kept refusing to let damage become final. And before Joe ever touched the Memphis Belle, he had already learned how unforgiving that work could be. Long before England, Joe Giambrone entered the Air Corps in 1940 as a private from Pennsylvania. One more young American being pulled into an aviation service that was expanding faster than its own traditions. At Chanute Field, he went through aircraft mechanics school, learning engines, systems, structures, inspection, and the exacting discipline of keeping a machine airworthy. The training was technical, but the profession taught itself in danger. On one early flight, while accompanying Colonel Stanley Ray to collect a new B-17, an emergency turned bizarre. Auxiliary tanks installed in the bomb bay blocked access to the hand crank needed to raise the landing gear. Ordered to get rid of the tanks, the crew managed to drop one, but the other jammed. Giambrone was told to crawl into the bomb bay with a rope around his waist and kick the stubborn tank loose in mid-air. He did, and it finally fell onto a farmer's chicken coop. On another day, he climbed a ladder to check an oil pressure sensor during an engine run-up, and the propeller blast threw the ladder out from under him, leaving him hanging onto the airplane itself. He climbed back up and tried again. These were not colorful side stories. They were the profession in miniature. Wartime aviation taught its mechanics that every task sat inches away from disaster. By the time Joe moved through bomber units in the United States and prepared to ship overseas, he had learned a lesson far more valuable than classroom procedure. Airplanes failed in ordinary moments first, and a mechanic survived by assuming that every routine job could become an emergency without warning. Then came the assignment that changed his relationship to the machines around him. Before the Memphis Belle, Joe later remembered, The bombers had all seemed roughly the same. Once he became that aircraft's crew chief, the sameness vanished. The bomber acquired a personality because responsibility gave it one. He began to know its weaknesses, its sounds, its moods after a hard mission, the little clues that told him whether an engine problem was minor or the beginning of something fatal. That sense of ownership was not sentimental. It was operational. Crew chiefs in the 8th Air Force were expected to treat one aircraft almost as a private domain. If it flew well, if it came back, if it made the next mission, that reflected on them as directly as any evaluation report. Joe drove his men hard because the aircraft had become his in the only way wartime machinery could belong to someone, through unending labor. They checked compression. They hunted oil leaks. They patched holes at first with fabric and glue, later with aluminum and pop rivets as better methods spread through the line. They learned to diagnose damage by habit rather than surprise. The airplane was no longer a bomber in the abstract. It was a moving list of recurring problems, all of them tied to 10 human lives the next time it crossed the channel. That intimacy made one question unavoidable. If a single mechanic could come to know one bomber so completely, how many such men did it take to keep an entire Air Force alive? The answer begins by breaking the legend of the Memphis Belle apart. The familiar version of the story suggests a perfect arrangement. One aircraft, one crew, 25 missions, then home. The record is more revealing. The men most associated with the Belle did not fly all 25 of their combat missions in that airplane because aircraft availability did not allow such neat continuity. They flew several of those sorties in other B-17s. The Memphis Belle herself also flew combat missions with other crews. The crew's celebrated 25th mission in May 1943 was, in fact, the airplane's 24th. 2 days later, the aircraft completed its own 25th mission with different men aboard. At first, that seems to disturb the myth. In reality, it exposes the true scale of the system. The 8th Air Force could not afford romance in its scheduling. Aircraft went where readiness permitted. Crews went where aircraft were available. Damage, maintenance backlogs, and operational tempo constantly reshuffled what the public later remembered as fixed pairings. Even the most famous bomber in the American war story was really part of a larger circulation of machines, personnel, and repair decisions. That discovery does not diminish the Memphis Belle. It makes the story more impressive. Survival was not the result of one lucky airplane and one lucky crew moving in a straight line. It was the result of a maintenance culture strong enough to absorb substitutions, casualties, and battle damage without collapsing the whole enterprise. And once that hidden machinery is visible, the emotional burden on men like Joe becomes easier to understand. As mission hour approached, the tension on the ground could be almost as ritualized as the tension in the briefing room. Men drifted to the landing strip, not because anyone ordered them there, but because the return had become the psychological center of the day. They listened for familiar engines. They tried to identify aircraft by markings before they were close enough to confirm. They dreaded the sight of flares that meant wounded men were coming home. Joe remembered one specific fear that tells its own story about the maintenance reality of 1943, a bullet hole through an oil cooler. On paper, it was a relatively small piece of battle damage. On the line, it could ground an airplane completely because you could not fly without the part and replacement coolers were not always available when needed. That is how the war looked from below. Not as a grand debate over strategy, but as the difference between one damaged component and a bomber missing tomorrow's formation. Every returning aircraft became an argument between chance and repair. Every empty hardstand became proof that repair had run out of time for someone else. And still the line had to keep moving. The emotional life of the mechanic was trapped inside repetition. Wait, count, inspect, repair, sleep too little, and wait again. But outside Joe's hardstand, the scale was becoming almost impossible to comprehend. The same labor that haunted one crew chief's day was being repeated across a giant American armada, stretching over eastern England. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force had become something unprecedented. More than 200,000 people under one vast aerial command, capable of sending more than 2,000 four-engine bombers and 1,000 fighters on a single mission. Across East Anglia, hundreds of thousands of Americans passed through airfields, depots, workshops, and service installations built for a war that demanded constant motion. By the end of the fighting in Europe, the 8th bombers would fly more than 440,000 sorties and drop 697,000 tons of bombs. The organization would suffer over 5,100 aircraft losses and more than 26,000 dead. But even these immense totals still hide the labor inside them. Wartime planners estimated that putting 500 heavy bombers over a target required the combined effort of roughly 75,000 officers and men, only a fraction of whom ever flew. Another measure put it even more clearly. The Army Air Forces required 4 technical ground specialists for every flyer. The image of the air war changes completely once those proportions are understood. A bomber stream over Germany was not merely a formation of aircraft. It was the visible tip of an invisible workforce spread across hangars, dispersal points, fuel depots, bomb dumps, training schools, and repair shops. Joe Giambrone was one man beside one airplane, but the system behind him was continental in scale. And if that scale was hard to imagine from the runway, the way it was organized was even more surprising. Picture a damaged bomber pulled off the line at dusk. The crew chief and his assistants crawl over it first, checking what can be handled immediately beside the hard stand. If the damage is light, the airplane may be serviced, adjusted, patched, and returned without ever leaving the squadron area. If the problem is heavier, periodic inspection overdue, an engine needing replacement, repairs requiring more tools and more time, the aircraft passes deeper into the unit's maintenance structure. If battle damage is worse still, the bomber may go to a service group or sub-depot where larger assemblies can be removed, structures repaired, parts fabricated, and salvage work performed. And if the aircraft is too badly worn or damaged, for anything short of major restoration, depots take over, stripping engines, overhauling equipment, incorporating technical changes, and reclaiming aircraft that can no longer fly. That was the 4-echelon maintenance system of the Army Air Forces. But it did not feel like a chart when men were working inside it. It felt like movement, machines being pushed, towed, opened, drained, lifted, and redistributed according to need. First echelon lived on the line. Second echelon followed close behind with mobile equipment and heavier routine work. Third echelon handled field repairs and salvage. Fourth echelon restored what the front could not save by itself. The system looks orderly on paper. In practice, it was fluid, flexible, and often blurred by operational pressure. Aircraft moved through it the way casualties moved through a hospital chain. And just as important, the chain had to be staffed by a flood of newly trained specialists. In the United States, technical schools were creating that flood almost as fast as the war could consume it. At places like Chanute Field and Shepherd, young Americans arrived from civilian life and were turned into maintainers through months of instruction in engines, electrical systems, hydraulics, structures, propellers, instruments, fuel systems, inspection, and repair. Some went on to factory courses with aircraft manufacturers, learning the peculiarities of specific types from the companies that built them. On paper, the process looked methodical. In reality, it was an emergency measured in classrooms and toolboxes. The Army Air Forces needed not dozens or thousands of mechanics, but an entirely new technical population. By the end of procurement in 1944, the service had trained roughly 670,000 enlisted aircraft maintenance specialists, almost 129,000 armament specialists, and nearly 300,000 radio specialists. That is one of the least remembered mobilizations of the war. Not just a nation building aircraft, but a nation teaching itself to understand them. Farm boys, garage mechanics, machinists, college students, men who had never seen a B-17 except in photographs. Now they were being taught to keep aircraft with tens of thousands of parts alive under combat conditions. Yet the schools were only the beginning. When men reached England, North Africa, or Italy, they discovered that formal training had given them vocabulary, not fluency. The real language of wartime maintenance was learned outdoors, in rain, darkness, and haste, from older hands who could save an hour because they knew exactly which panel to open first. And the places where they practiced that language were anything but comfortable. On bomber bases in England, the mechanics' world was cold, improvised, and exhausting. Some lived in Nissen huts, packed with cots and damp gear. Others built crude line shacks from bomb crates near the repair areas. because walking farther from the airplanes felt like wasting time they no longer owned. Before dawn, flight line crews stumbled awake, dressed in layered clothing stiff with weather, and headed out toward aircraft glazed with frost or rainwater. Maintenance did not wait for decent conditions. Engines were changed in snow. Inspections were carried out with numb fingers. Night work went on under blackout restrictions, flashlights cupped low, men feeling for fittings they could barely see. Scheduled inspections came due at 25, 50, and 100 hours. Engines that reached overhaul limits had to come off. Windshields and mirrors had to be cleaned. Fluids checked. Magnetos tested. Tires, controls, oxygen systems, armament, radios, hydraulic lines. Nothing could be trusted just because it had worked yesterday. Joe Giambrone's hardstand was not exceptional. It was typical. That is what makes it powerful. The famous and the obscure lived under the same pressure. The Memphis Belle's crew chief slept too little, worked too long, and learned the same lesson as countless others on the line. Aircraft readiness was built in miserable little increments, most of them unseen. Yet keeping a bomber mechanically alive was only part of the burden. Every mission also required another group of men to load destruction into the airplane itself. At the bomb dump, the work looked less like aviation than a dangerous form of heavy industry. Bomb casings had to be moved, fitted with tail fins, fused, and prepared for loading before they were hoisted into waiting bomb bays. Ordnance crews handled the deadliest cargo on the base every day, and they did it around trucks, trailers, mud, fatigue, and constant pressure from operations schedules. The danger was not theoretical. In July 1944 at Metfield in England, American ordnance personnel unloading high-explosive bombs suffered the nightmare every bomb dump feared. One bomb detonated. The explosion set off roughly 1,200 tons of bombs. 5 men were killed. More than 20 B-24s were destroyed or permanently grounded, and other aircraft were damaged. The blast was heard for miles. In a single instant, a support area behind the front became a catastrophe zone. It is tempting to separate the glamour of the bombing offensive from the labor of the bomb dump, but the two were inseparable. A bomber force that wanted to appear over Germany at dawn first had to survive its own industrial violence on the ground. Mechanics, armorers, ordnance crews, and transport personnel all worked inside an environment where a mistake could destroy aircraft without a single German fighter ever appearing. If the workload on the line was overwhelming, the hazards behind the line were just as real. And when the story shifts from heavy bombers to fighters, the hidden labor becomes even more compressed. On a fighter field, the rhythm was faster and the margin for delay even smaller. A typical P-51 or P-47 line crew might consist of a crew chief, an assistant crew chief, and an armorer. 3 men carrying responsibility that would seem impossible if described only in paperwork. They serviced the aircraft, inspected controls, topped off fluids, checked guns, polished windscreens, watched for leaks, managed forms, and prepared the fighter for another escort or training mission. Flying hours accumulated rapidly because these aircraft were used constantly, and the result was a relentless cycle of scheduled inspections and unscheduled repair. Much of the work spilled into the night. Mechanics later remembered operating under blackout conditions with only small flashlights, gasoline fumes hanging around loaded machine guns, while propellers and exhausts made every movement dangerous. They also remembered being chronically understaffed. On paper, there were technical orders for everything. In practice, the distance between a library and a muddy hardstand could mean that experience mattered more than manuals. A fighter squadron's readiness often rested on tiny crews who learned to improvise because there was no alternative. If a bomber base felt like a heavy industrial yard, a fighter field felt like a machine under tension. Every component expected to function at speed, and those crews faced the same old wartime companion Joe knew so well: shortage. Shortage taught mechanics to become inventors, thieves of time, and surgeons of wreckage. Across Britain, men made tools they did not have, borrowed tools they were never officially issued, or quietly acquired materials by methods no one bothered to describe too closely as long as aircraft kept flying. If a needed part was unavailable, wrecked aircraft became donors. Cannibalization was not an occasional trick, it was part of the ecosystem. A bomber or fighter too badly damaged to repair immediately might yield pumps, fittings, instruments, cowling sections, wiring, wheels, or entire assemblies to save another aircraft before the next operation. Shops fabricated minor parts when supply channels lagged behind combat tempo. Crew chiefs bent procedure when procedure threatened readiness. Official boundaries existed, but the line redrew them constantly. What mattered was not elegance. It was serviceability by morning. The hidden Air Force was learning that reliability could be manufactured not only in factories, but on the field by men willing to raid the dead to save the living. That improvisational culture did not stay confined to England. In the Mediterranean, it became even more extreme, because the environment itself began trying to destroy the aircraft. In North Africa, and later Italy, maintenance looked different before a word was spoken. Dust blew across pierced steel planking. Engines inhaled grit. Temporary strips sat close to the fighting, exposed to weather and sudden attack. There were fewer permanent facilities, longer supply lines, and less patience from the war around them. Here, mobile machine shops mattered enormously. Mechanics used lathes mounted on trailers to fabricate or repair parts when replacements were unavailable. Sand cut into engines with a persistence no briefing chart could fully capture. In Sicily, men dealing with shrapnel damage scavenged parts from other aircraft to bring crippled machines back into use. Ground personnel landed close behind invading troops to establish airfields under hazardous conditions, so fighters could move forward with the campaign. The visual contrast with eastern England is striking. No vast brick depots nearby, no settled countryside, but raw operational terrain, where aviation infrastructure had to be built almost as fast as aircraft could use it. And yet the logic was identical to Joe Giambrone's hard stand. Keep the airplane available. Protect the mission tomorrow. Hide the labor so completely that the sortie appears inevitable. By now, the audience begins to feel the workload piling up from every direction. Weather, damage, inspection cycles, supply failures, tempo, and distance. But the first emotional peak of the story arrives when that pressure is reduced to one hard stand, one bomber, and one nearly impossible repair. On the Memphis Belle's stand, the manual said changing an engine on a B-17 took 25 hours. The line said otherwise. Joe Giambrone's crew got so fast that one day they changed an engine in 4. That single statistic contains an entire world. Hoists rolling into place, cowlings off, lines disconnected, bolts freed, a dead engine lowered and dragged aside, another swung into position, men moving without wasted motion, because the airplane had to be ready again. Over the Belle's 8-month combat tour, Joe and his crew changed engines repeatedly, 9 times. Sometimes because enemy fire had torn them up, sometimes because compression tests showed the numbers falling, sometimes because keeping a bomber in the air meant replacing a failing component before it turned a mission into a funeral. During stretches of good weather, missions could be flown on successive days, and the ground crews worked all night to keep up. This is where the hidden heroism of maintenance stops being metaphor. It becomes physical courage of a different kind, the courage to keep working accurately while exhausted, because the price of sloppiness will be paid by someone else at 25,000 feet. The crew chief did not ride into the raid. He had to imagine it. He had to look at the engine he had just installed and understand that 10 men were about to entrust it with their lives. But even an extraordinary engine change could not solve the larger mystery. How did the system keep learning fast enough to survive a war that kept making new kinds of damage? One answer arrived in paper form. After the excitement of battle damage and emergency repair came reports. Forms describing defects, failures, damaged components, recurring weaknesses, and unsatisfactory performance. To an outsider, this looks bureaucratic. In wartime aviation, it was one of the ways the force taught itself. If line crews discovered a part that failed repeatedly, or a procedure that no longer matched reality, the problem could travel back through maintenance channels and become data. Air Service Command and related maintenance organizations studied these defects, circulated remedies, and turned frontline experience into wider technical correction. So imagine 2 parallel scenes unfolding at once. On one side of England, a mechanic kneels on a wing route, tracing a fault through a bomber that has just returned from Germany. Somewhere far from that hardstand, engineers and maintenance authorities study the accumulated reports from hundreds of similar cases, looking for patterns. The bomber offensive was brutal, but it was also adaptive. It improved because mechanics fed the system evidence. What looks in memory like raw American abundance was also a learning machine, taking every leak, crack, and failure and asking how to make the next aircraft survive longer. Joe Giambrone's instinct for the Memphis Belle existed inside that larger network of correction, and if the line could not solve a problem, another layer of the hidden Air Force was waiting farther back, where wrecks stopped looking like losses and started looking like work. Inside the depots, the visual world changed again. Here, the mud of the hardstand gave way to cranes, engine stands, stripped airframes, racks of parts, welding sparks, and rows of damaged aircraft in various stages of disassembly. A bomber that a crew chief could not save beside the runway might arrive here looking beyond hope. Landing gear collapsed, skin shredded, systems gutted, engines worn down to overhaul condition. Depot personnel treated such machines less as individual aircraft than as recoverable combinations of assemblies, structures, and labor hours. Fourth echelon maintenance restored worn or damaged aircraft to tactical serviceability, overhauled engines and accessories, fabricated parts, carried out technical modifications, and reclaimed airframes that could no longer fly on their own. This was not glamorous salvage. It was industrial resurrection. The Army Air Forces eventually expended more than 203 million depot maintenance man-hours in the continental United States alone, on airplanes, engines, and related jobs. Behind every sortie count stood places like this, where aircraft disappeared into the maintenance machine and emerged fit for combat again. The emotional center of the story is still Joe on his hardstand, but the second emotional peak rises here. A heavily damaged bomber returns from the edge of destruction. A depot, or service group, tears it open, rebuilds it, and sends it back toward the front. The miracle is no longer one man's skill. It is the existence of a whole civilization designed to reverse mechanical death. And once that civilization matured, it began shaping the war in ways the enemy could feel. One of the clearest examples came from the Tuskegee Airmen's ground cruise in March 1945. The scene opens not with fighters in the sky, but with mechanics discovering a shortage on the ground. The 332nd Fighter Group was preparing for a mission to Berlin when its men realized they lacked enough 110-gallon auxiliary fuel tanks for the escort. Without those tanks, range collapsed. Without range, the bombers would go deep into Germany with thinner protection. Less than 9 hours remained before takeoff. The crisis was logistical, but the mechanics understood its strategic meaning instantly. They learned that a train carrying the needed tanks was within reach, drove out without authorization, stopped it, took the tanks, brought them back, and worked through the night refitting the fighters. By morning, the escort could go. This episode later became known as the Great Train Robbery, but the real importance lies in what it reveals. American air power in Europe was not only sustained by massive official systems. At key moments, it was rescued by local initiative from mechanics who understood what a missing part could do to the whole campaign. The men on that fighter line were not abstract support personnel. They were reading the map through hardware. And when long-range American escorts began appearing reliably over Berlin, the effect on Germany was unmistakable. German leaders and airmen did not need access to Allied maintenance reports to sense that something had changed. When American escort fighters began reaching Berlin in strength, Hermann Göring treated their appearance over the capital as a sign that Germany's air defense crisis had become grave. The meaning was obvious. Range had ceased to protect the Reich in the way it once had. Meanwhile, Albert Speer and other German leaders were confronting another realization from the industrial side. The United States was not merely building huge numbers of aircraft, it was sustaining an operational air offensive of a scale Germany found increasingly impossible to match. That distinction mattered. Factories could produce machines, but only a functioning maintenance system could turn inventory into relentless daily pressure. From the German perspective, the terrifying quality of American air power was not just the size of an individual raid. It was the fact that battered formations kept returning, that escorts pushed farther, that losses did not end the offensive, and that the machinery behind the raids seemed deeper than immediate destruction could solve. The enemy did not see Joe Giambrone checking seams in the dark. It saw the consequence of men like him. Aircraft that should have been absent were present again. Formations that should have thinned regenerated. A campaign that should have broken under attrition continued to grow harder. But for the mechanics themselves, none of this eased the pace. If anything, the great offensives of 1944 made their days more desperate than ever. As the bombing campaign deepened in 1943 and 1944, the pressure on maintenance crews became almost unbearable. Big raids meant big losses, but they also meant unprecedented numbers of damaged aircraft, making it back to England. After operations such as Bremen, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and the attacks that culminated in Big Week, bombers arrived home with flak holes, shredded control surfaces, damaged engines, jammed guns, oxygen failures, shattered plexiglass, and structural wounds that demanded immediate judgment. Could the aircraft be patched by the squadron? Did it need an engine change overnight? Was it bound for a service group? Was it salvageable at all? Joe Giambrone's world on the Memphis Belle was a concentrated version of that larger triage. He and his men sometimes worked 25 straight hours on battle damage, breaking only to eat, and still aimed to have the bomber ready for the next mission. To the aircrew walking out before dawn, a bomber either sat in the lineup or it did not. What they often could not see was that its presence there might represent an entire night of sustained labor by a small crew who had made the difference between absence and appearance. That is how operational readiness shapes strategy from below. Formations large enough to protect themselves, bombardment schedules aggressive enough to strain German defenses, and campaigns extended deep into the Reich all depended on thousands of unseen readiness decisions made one aircraft at a time. And just when the narrative seems ready to dissolve into scale, Joe Giambrone returns to anchor it in something painfully personal. The Memphis Belle was damaged repeatedly during its combat life. On one mission to Rouen, tail gunner John Quinlan was wounded when flak tore through the tail. At other times, the aircraft was taken out of service while battle damage was repaired. A formal damage report signed by Master Sergeant Giambrone survives to remind us that even an iconic bomber spent part of its existence not as a symbol, but as a problem set: holes to patch, tail damage to fix, components to inspect, airworthiness to restore. This is the crucial reversal in the story. Public memory tends to treat the Belle's successful tour as proof of luck or exceptional flying skill. Those mattered. But the more closely the aircraft is examined, the more survival begins to look like maintenance history. The bomber reached fame not in spite of its repairs, but through them. It survived because somebody put it back into condition over and over again. Even the celebrated image of the crew after the final mission changes under that light. Their relief is real. Their fame is real. But standing behind both is a quieter record of labor that made the moment possible. Joe's bond with the airplane deepened precisely because he knew how many times it had nearly been removed from the story. And once the Belle completed its tour, his own experience produced one of the most revealing moments in the entire documentary. When the Memphis Belle was sent back to the United States for its war bond tour, Joe Giambrone hoped he might go with it. He did not. The airplane left England. He remained to take charge of another bomber. In the letter he later wrote to pilot Robert Morgan, the revealing point was not bitterness. It was attachment. Joe described how he had come to know every part of the Belle, how he and his crew had raced the clock on engine changes and repairs, how he could almost sense what was wrong when the airplane became sick. He wrote as a man separated from a machine that had become the center of his war. That is an emotional fact modern audiences often miss. For crew chiefs, ownership was not metaphorical. It produced grief when the aircraft went away, even under happy circumstances. Joe had wanted the Belle to still be flying when it was finally his turn to go home. Instead, the bomber left first, and he stayed behind with the system. That reversal carries enormous meaning. The public story of the bomber tour ended in triumph. The mechanic's story did not end at all. There was always another aircraft waiting, another crew, another engine, another night shift. The individual icon could leave the stage. The maintenance network could not. And if the audience has followed Joe this far, One larger revelation is now ready to land with full force. At the peak of its wartime growth in March 1944, the Army Air Forces counted more than 2.4 million personnel. In July of that year, it had 79,908 aircraft on hand. From December 1941 through August 1945, it flew 2,362,800 combat sorties. Those totals are enormous enough to numb the imagination, so it helps to bring them back to ground level. Every one of those aircraft required inspection, servicing, armament, fueling, records, repairs, periodic maintenance, and eventually overhaul. The service had trained hundreds of thousands of technical specialists to meet that burden. Depots in the United States alone consumed more than 203 million man-hours on aircraft, engines, and related maintenance jobs during the crucial later years of the war. The third emotional peak arrives here, not in a dogfight, but in the realization that Joe Giambrone's hardstand was just one cell in a global technical organism. When he changed an engine in 4 hours, he was performing an act that only made sense because schools, factories, depots, supply lines, shipping routes, and maintenance doctrine already existed behind him. When the Tuskegee mechanics stole fuel tanks from a train, they were improvising inside that same organism. When a battered bomber left a depot restored to serviceability, it was the far end of the same chain. The hidden American advantage in the air was not merely industrial quantity, it was the ability to connect quantity to readiness through people. And yet even that massive realization is not the end of the story, because human relationships inside the system remained unexpectedly fragile. Pilots and mechanics often lived beside one another without really knowing one another. Aircrew fear had its own closed world. Briefings, flak maps, target photographs, casualty lists, the mental arithmetic of how many missions remained. Ground crews had another world entirely, built out of weather, schedules, and recurring damage. Some pilots later admitted that they regretted not getting to know their crews better, but before missions, they were too occupied by their own apprehension to bridge the distance. That distance says something profound about modern war. The people who trusted one another most were not always those who spoke most often. A crew climbed into a bomber because someone else had already inspected its engines, checked its controls, loaded its bombs, and signed off on its condition. A mechanic spent the night making sure an aircraft would fly, then watched another man take it into danger. Trust was practical before it was personal. Yet personal feelings still leaked through. Ground crews waited for specific aircraft because they knew the men aboard. Crew chiefs felt heartbreak when their bombers missed the lineup or never returned. Some became so attached to their assigned aircraft that they resisted leave, unwilling to let another man care for the machine in their absence. Joe Giambrone's letter after the Belle departed belongs to that emotional territory. It reveals the inner cost of invisibility. The mechanic might not be seen as central to the mission, but the mission had become central to him. And that makes the final realization of the film sharper, not softer. The American advantage in the air was often described in terms of bombers, escorts, production totals, fuel, or doctrine. All of those mattered. But strip away the romance of flight, and a harder truth appears. Aircraft did not win the air war by existing. They won it by being available repeatedly under combat conditions. A B-17 on a factory floor meant nothing to the men over Germany until it had been accepted, delivered, serviced, armed, repaired, and kept in a condition fit for more than one mission. A P-51 with the range to reach Berlin still needed tanks fitted, guns maintained, fluids checked, and recurring defects caught before takeoff. Even the most advanced aircraft of the war were helpless without the labor that translated engineering into readiness. German leaders eventually grasped the result, if not always the mechanism. What faced them was not a series of isolated American raids, but a self-renewing system that absorbed loss and damage and still returned in force. The strategic bombing campaign, with all its controversy and cost, was also a demonstration of maintenance power on a continental scale. Joe Giambrone's hands on the Memphis Belle form the intimate version of that truth. Behind him stood an army of specialists, rarely granted center frame. Their labor was not glamorous enough for legend, which is precisely why legend could stand on it. We are now close to the film's final discovery. The title has been pointing toward one mechanic all along. The answer turns out to be both narrower and larger than that. Joseph Giambrone really was the kind of American mechanic who could keep a famous bomber flying through damage, exhaustion, and impossible turnarounds. His record proves it. He trained in the expanding pre-war Air Corps, followed bomber units across the United States, reached England as a technical sergeant, led a 10-man ground crew, changed B-17 engines with astonishing speed, repaired battle damage through the night, and signed the damage reports that turned the Memphis Belle from a crippled returning aircraft into a mission-ready machine again and again. But his importance lies in how completely he represents something larger. He is the visible face of men who were usually kept invisible by the altitude of the story. The American mechanic, who quietly kept an entire Air Force flying, was Joe Giambrone. It was also the assistant crew chiefs on nearby hardstands, the ordnance crews at the bomb dump, the depot workers stripping engines under cranes, the Tuskegee mechanics who understood range well enough to hijack a train, the line chiefs in North Africa fighting sand with improvisation, the specialists in machine trailers fabricating parts when supply failed, the teachers in technical schools, the radio men, armorers, and inspectors whose names rarely crossed into public memory. Singular and plural merge, because modern air war forced them together. One man can anchor the story, but only thousands can complete it. So return, one last time, to the airfield before dawn. Joe Giambrone stands beside the Memphis Belle, while the sky is still colorless. Around him, the hidden Air Force is already waking. Trucks carrying bombs, men hauling hoses, armorers checking fuses, depot trains moving parts, paperwork passing through hands that know what each delay might cost. Somewhere in Germany, anti-aircraft guns are waiting for the formation that has not yet lifted off. Somewhere in headquarters, commanders are counting sortie rates and losses. But at this hour, the war is still local and physical. It is one mechanic laying a hand on patched metal and deciding whether today this airplane belongs to history or to the ground. That is the hidden truth the documentary has been moving toward. America's greatest air advantage in World War II was not simply the B-17 or the Mustang or the factory miracle that built them in such numbers. It was the invisible population of people who refused to let those machines become useless after one hard day. They lifted engines, read manuals, ignored sleep, filed reports, fabricated parts, scavenged wrecks, loaded bombs, and turned damage into one more sortie. The bomber took the battle to Europe. The mechanic made sure it could come back, be made whole, and go again. That is how an entire Air Force kept flying, quietly, relentlessly, and mostly out of sight, until the hidden men on the ground became one of the